Tom, are you okay?
I lost her.
Her?
She was going to be this epic, trilogy-worthy character. I was going to be the hottest writer in Hollywood. But I can't get past Act 1!
You need some writers group therapy. Hello and welcome to Writers Group Therapy.
I'm Tom.
And I'm Roshni. We're writers helping writers. Are you ready for your session? The doctors are in. And if you want to find us online, you can do so at writersgrouptherapy.com. We're also on Twitter at WGTherapy. And our individual handles?
Tom_Loveman on Twitter and Tom Loveman on Instagram.
And I am at Moonlily Music on Instagram and at Roshni Lamino on Twitter. That's where you can find us. Whoa! So it's so funny. We were talking about branding before we got on today's episode. And I think maybe because I've had to do so many of those stupid personal essays, but branding is a really interesting thing for writers. I wonder if it's as important as it is for actors and singers and stuff like that. Because if you've ever watched, say, American Idol or, The Voice or something, and when they start narrowing down people, they do those personal interviews and they always have the sob story of like, I came on the show for my mom who passed away and I love her. And then you're like, okay, take my vote because you're just like, oh, it's such a great story, and there's Hollywood stories, like I think it was Zoe Saldana who had like $20 to her name, and then she landed Avatar, things like that, where people nearly gave up on Hollywood, and then
Yeah.
the big break happened. But what is your writer's story, and does it matter if you have one?
Well, I think anytime, somebody, achieves some form of success and then you kind of wonder how they did it, it's always interesting to see how they did. And, we always like to applaud people who, overcome adversity or physical issues or mental issues to rise above and be successful. I mean, that's kind of, the hero story we all like. For writers, though, it seems like they just want to know if we can write. Can you write something that people will watch? I love American Ninja Warrior. They do the same thing there. It seems like you can't be a competitor on there if you haven't, gone through a gauntlet of adversity and health problems and personal, tragedy. And maybe it makes for good television, because people like to root for an underdog and see people succeed when they've, had to deal with so much hardship. But for writers, I think we all deal with hardship. And then once we're successful, I don't think anyone really, goes, oh, remember when he was living in that tiny studio apartment behind the Roosevelt Hotel and walking to work and giving tours in Hollywood, stuff like that. Nobody ever really thinks about that.
I mean, maybe because writers are more behind the scenes, but I wonder also now that there's a bigger push for diversity and stuff like that, I would argue, especially for people of color, having a writer's story, like a backstory, is a big deal.
Sure, absolutely. And especially when people are writing about, the worlds that they came from and the adversity they had to overcome. So if you grew up in the South Side of Chicago, where you deal with violence and gun violence and drugs and gangs, and you actually got out of there and got an education and learned to write or wrote about that, and how you survived that. That's truly impressive, and to overcome that kind of ordeal to succeed.
So, I mean, so you're kind of saying, in a general sense, it doesn't matter, but maybe for like specialized pieces, your backstory does matter.
Well, I can't exactly write, Get Out. I don't have, Jordan Peele has a unique perspective on that, and he's bringing some really cool stuff to the theater that
Yeah.
only he can bring, or a person of color could bring. There are people who are going to try to write a movie like that, and everyone's going to go, yeah, sure. If I wrote it, they'd look at me and go, oh, how did the middle-aged white Jewish guy from Cleveland, write this story about, growing up in the South Side of Chicago or whatever? So I definitely think people who have those stories should tell them, and as part of their, why they wanted to be a writer, it should definitely be part of that. My story will never be quite as interesting.
Not necessarily.
I don't know. It's been an interesting ride.
I mean, okay, so that's actually a really good point. So I'm a minority woman. You're a white guy.
I've been
If
told.
people weren't sure, right? But I mean, especially because I am applying to fellowships and stuff like that geared towards minorities. So I'm constantly asked in personal essays, you know, when did you overcome diversity? What was it like being a minority? And they do ask in a roundabout way, what is your story as a writer? Now I know you're not necessarily applying for those same fellowships, but no one's ever approached you and asked for your backstory. Like when you go into a pitch for, to an agent or something and you're selling yourself as a writer, they never say, and who is Tom Loveman?
No, of course they do. And I think in my case, I grew up in a suburban family, middle class, upper middle class. So my story is not about the adversity I overcame. It's more about the creativity and why I want to be a writer. I've
Mhm.
written personal statements, and I spent years working in marketing and advertising. I guess my one unique diversity thing you might consider is my age, because I didn't start doing this until I was like 40. So I'm not the 20 something kind of millennial coming up out of film school. So that's but that's not really anything particularly that groundbreaking. But I try to tell people how I decided to pursue this, because it's definitely something different that I didn't plan on doing when I was in school. Making a big change in your life in midlife like this is not easy to do. And I moved all the way across the country from my family and have kind of, struggled here in LA, but no more than anyone else. I don't think I deserve any extra credit for that. So I just focus on being a good writer.
Which obviously that's always where it starts is you focus on the craft and the cream rises to the top. But I would argue with social media being such a big deal nowadays, even as a writer, and you're kind of more behind the scenes, I would argue your backstory probably matters more than you think it does because I mean, obviously, it's a little bit more for people who are more visible, like a singer, like an actor, even a director. But um, I follow various creatives on Instagram, and it's amazing how much of their personal story plays into their creative branding. And so I would argue because of social media, even when you're putting yourself up as a writer, you're like, I love horror and I love drama, and that's because when I was a kid I used to sit in front of watching Star Trek all day with my uncle or something. I don't know, whatever your backstory is for
It
why you
was
love
my
sci-fi.
mom, but yeah, it was Star Trek and it was my mom.
But you know what I'm saying
Yeah,
though, and that makes fans endear to you
sure.
because now they feel they know who Tom is. I love Star Trek too, and I used to watch it with my grandma who, my parents died, and so I watch it with grandma, and it gives me warm fuzzies whenever I see Star
Yeah.
Trek, that kind of thing. And so because of social media, I think your backstory and your branding matters more than ever, even if you think it doesn't.
Well, and kind of the devil's advocate is that is sometimes it can matter too much. sometimes
Yes, that's true.
sometimes we say things on I'm very careful on what I post online, because I know that that's never going to be go away. People, that always comes back to haunt you, it seems. And James
Mhm.
Gunn and some of these other directors and producers, they could have said stuff 10 years ago on social media, but it's still out there, and it's hurt some careers, it's helped some careers, it's but it's definitely something you should pay attention to. So your story, I guess you kind of have to watch. If you're young now and you're starting out, think about that. If you're starting your career now, and in 10 years you're going to be wanting to working in Hollywood and stuff, what are you putting out online, and how's that going to reflect on you as a person when you're out here working with people? Because your story, obviously who you are as a person and where you come from,
Mhm.
that matters to people, because we're in a people business at the end of the day. We have to work with a lot of people from a lot of different places and
Yeah.
walks of life and socioeconomic things, and everything you do is going to color how you are able to work with others.
Yeah, and the most interesting thing about all those cases, that would be a whole nother podcast, is people's stories and lives and even beliefs evolve and change. But it is amazing how you will be held on the hook for a belief you might have had 10 years
Hmm.
ago.
We're seeing that
So,
very prominently today in a
yeah,
lot of
so
areas.
in part of your backstory, like maybe, I mean, this is like totally left field, but maybe, you thought that everyone should, kill kittens or something. And then you
Oh
became an,
God.
you know what I mean? And then 10 years later, you're like, I love nature and animals or something. But whatever you put out there and it becomes all part of your narrative. So you do have to watch, you know what I'm saying? That
Yeah.
was maybe a little extreme. Please
No,
don't kill
yeah.
kittens. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Roshni has 2 cats. It's
yeah.
okay.
But you know what I'm
She would
saying?
never do
Like,
that.
if you had a strong belief one way and then you change your mind 10 years later, if you put it out there, it becomes part of your narrative. And yeah,
Yeah. And it's not
yeah,
that, that you can't evolve and grow over time, but your writer's story is going to be part of your whole career. Make it a good one, right?
yeah. That's good advice. So, how about for all of you? What is part of your writer's story? Let us know at WG Therapy. And you can also find us online at writersgrouptherapy.com. And if you like what you hear, subscribe and share it with your friends. We'll see you next week.